Welcome to this session on collaboration, not conflict, new tools and partnerships to advance economic stability and development in fragile and conflict-affected states. So my name's Liz David-Barrett. I'm the director of the Centre for the Study of Corruption at the University of Sussex. And I'm delighted to be joined by this distinguished panel today. We have on my left here Dr. Diane Zovigyan, an independent political economy analysis expert specializing in fragile and conflict-affected states, and an academic also teaching at Sciences Po and at IBEI in Barcelona. Next we have Emmanuel Matias. He's the division chief of the Governance and Anti-Corruption Division, IMF's legal department. Then we have Kay Takandriana Rafitoson, who is the vice chair of Transparency International, and Viktor Pavlushchik, head of the Ukrainian Anti-Corruption Authority. So I'm sure you'll agree, a very distinguished panel. The way that the session is going to run is that I will ask a couple of rounds of questions to each of the panelists, and they will answer, and then we'll open up to the floor. So do please be thinking about what questions you'd like to ask them as they're speaking, and we should have plenty of time for those questions and for discussion afterwards. This is a really important topic. Fragile and conflict-affected states are home to nearly 1 billion people, and of course they face very complex and difficult challenges. Challenges that are often macro-critical, which can destabilize balance of payments positions, disrupt trade and financial flows, and hinder the development of productive resources. These are all areas that are of deep concern to international financial institutions and areas where potentially they can provide very important assistance. But it's also, of course, a context which is extremely difficult to operate in, something where the political settlement is often quite unstable, the interlocutors that we are dealing with are changing every day, and so there's a need to also be quite flexible and adaptive and pragmatic. And so some of the questions we're looking at today is how does that sort of need for flexibility and adaptability interact with needing to have quite formal conditions around international financial assistance? And how do we bring in local stakeholders of different types to that discussion and to ensure that the progress is not just on paper, but is actually in terms of implementation too. So I think some very important issues. I'm going to start with Diane. So just to remind everybody, Diane's a political economy expert. She teaches at Sciences Po and at IBEI in Barcelona and advises international organizations on political economy analysis. So Diane, could you start by telling us what political economy analysis is and how it can be used by institutions like the IMF and the World Bank?
Thank you, Liz. Good morning. Well, you know, international financial institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, but I think the broader anti-corruption community tends to, can struggle, right, in implementing, governance and anti-corruption reforms in fragile states, which, as you mentioned, tend to be places of where there's either conflict, instability, and in any case, weak institutions, so challenging places. And we now know, based on all of our collective experience, that many of those best practices for governance reforms just won't work. We have good laws that are not adopted, or when they're adopted are not implemented, or have perverse effects. And so I think we've all reached a collective understanding that good technical solutions won't work. We need technical solutions that work politically, right? And this is where political economy analysis comes in. It tries to sort of unpack how policy reform, policy change can happen in difficult environments. So as we all know, corruption tends to be systemic in many fragile countries. So one of the first things that political economy analysis does is ask, what's the system of corruption, or what are the rules of the corruption game? Is it a competitive game with multiple players? Is it a game that's dominated by one, right? And that tends to depend on the political system. What's the price for that game? And that will depend on the type of economy you have in place, whether it's dominated by the state or whether it's a market economy. And so, what are the rules of that corruption game? And then who plays that game, right? Who are the main actors, the main networks of corruption? What are their interests? What are their rents, right? And how do all those things come into the potential resistance or potential support for reform? And we pay particular attention in fragile states to, individuals, incentives, because institutions are weak, no? So we tend to sort of maybe give a bit more attention to sort of identifying coalition of actors that have incentives and interests to support reform. So that's the first thing that political economy analysis does, you were asking. And then the second thing it does, it sort of transforms that knowledge into a reform strategy. So how can change happen? How much might change happen? And this is where we sort of need to be a little bit politically savvy and think about, okay, what's the reform space in a given context, right? Given the political and economic context. Can we squeeze corruption out of certain sectors, certain institutions, because there is some sort of interest and incentives aligned in those institutions? So say, it's often very difficult to sort of reform the whole PFM, public financial management system in a country. Can we do this as a sector level, where IFIs are involved, for example, in service delivery in the education sector? Can we sort of work sectorally there? Can we build islands of integrity where we have, a reform coalition or a reform champion, say in the central bank, in the Ministry of Finance? And here, I think of Nigeria when Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala was Minister of Finance. You had in an ocean of corruption some level, a small island of integrity or of attempt at integrity, right? So it's what's the reform space? And then you were saying also, how can we sort of be smart about reforms? Are there some reform action that might not be best practice, but that are second best and for which there is sort of support, right? So it's bringing that thinking to bear on that might not be sort of the best good governance practices, but they might work in context, right? So that's what we're sort of looking at, and trying to sequence reform also in difficult places where there's little capacity. Then we can start with sort of quick wins, and then sort of build incentives and reform coalitions around that. So that's essentially the gist of it in a few minutes for a big topic, and we can get into examples maybe during the conversation.
Thanks so much, Diane. I think that's very helpful. Emmanuel, I'm going to turn to you next. So you're Chief of the Governance and Anti-Corruption Division of the IMF's Legal Department, and you've been spearheading the IMF's fairly new approach to anti-corruption in recent years, in particular with a very impressive governance diagnostics tool that your team's developed. So could you tell us how the IMF approaches the issue of governance and anti-corruption, and what does it mean for the issues raised by fragility and conflict to be seen as macro-critical?
Thank you, Liz. Good morning, all. As you know, the mandate of the IMF is mainly economic and financial stability. But back in 1997, we, as an institution, understood that achieving this mandate without looking at good governance would not work. And more recently, as Liz mentioned, in 2018, we thought that we need to go beyond good governance and really address corruption. And that's when we adopted a new framework, a new policy on governance and anti-corruption that had 4 main objectives. The first one is to be more candid, so to call corruption when there is corruption in our discussions with country authorities. The second one has been to be more systematic. So we identified 6 economic core functions that we looked at for all of our member countries. These includes, for example, how corruption relates to fiscal governance, how corruption relates to central bank operations, how corruption relates to financial sector oversight or the rule of law or anti-money laundering or market regulations. Then we have been aiming at being even-handed, so treating all our member countries similarly when situated in the same category. And finally, we have been trying to be more effective, which means ultimately trying to move the needle on issues that are considered for us macroeconomically critical. So what is macroeconomically critical? It's mostly the main economic policies of a country. If you think of foreign exchange, if you think of fiscal policies, this type of large-scale policy that have an impact on the health and the resilience of an economy. To illustrate, for instance, if you have a country that loses $100 million of tax revenues due to corruption, in some countries, let's say a G20 country, it may not be a lot. But if you go to a fragile economy, that's generally massive. And that is macro-critical. And if it's lost because of corruption, that's an area where, as staff of the IMF, we have to discuss with our member country authorities. And we have different avenues to discuss this, mostly 3 avenues. One is what we call surveillance. Every year with our 190 member countries, we have an economic health check. We call that Article 4 consultation. Staff of the IMF goes into the country and discuss macroeconomically relevant issues, including corruption when it is deemed to be macroeconomically relevant. The second is the lending. As you know, the IMF loans to countries that have balance of payment issues. And in this context, when corruption is severe, we may have conditions that relate to corruption. And the last one is technical assistance. And that's in this context that we developed the tool that Liz mentioned, which is named Governance and Corruption Diagnostic, which is a way that we have implemented for a few years to go deep dive on governance and corruption with our member countries. It's an exercise that takes 9 to 12 months, lots of understanding of the countries, reading what others have been doing, what civil society is saying. So headquarter work, and then on-site mission, discussion with the authorities, discussion with civil society, business community, other donors, in order to get a better understanding on how corruption works in a country, how these economic state functions that I mentioned are either hampered by corruption or do facilitate corruption. And that it is in this context that we also use political economy experts to help us understand the distribution of the rents, the networks of corruption. So far, we have done this for 20 countries, including a large number of fragile states. To give you an example, currently we are working with Haiti, Lebanon, and Burundi on this type of exercise. And these are very helpful then to inform our discussion with the authorities, including when we lend money and including when we have conditions, so that we are trying to tailor conditions so that ultimately they help move the needle on anti-corruption issues when these issues are relevant. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Emmanuel. So I'm going to move on to Kay now. I'm bringing you into the conversation, Kay, as the Vice Chair of Transparency International and the Executive Director of TI Madagascar. We've heard from Diane about how political economy analysis is about appreciating the local context, incentives and interests of people on the ground. We've heard from Emmanuel about how the IMF will try to always work with civil society organizations. Could you tell us a bit from your perspective of civil society, how can civil society organizations help the international actors with understanding that context? And perhaps give us some insight into the challenges that you encounter in that cooperative relationship.
Yeah, thank you so much, Liz, and hi everyone. Very glad to be here. So yeah, civil society is of course a key player in assessing local context and also helping international institutions shaping their anti-corruption policies, but also international aid and development policies. So we see three ways of doing so, three ways of contribution from CSOs. First of all, information and knowledge. This is key for informing international players about the local context, of course. It is also crucial, this information coming from the grassroots and the population is essential for giving those international actors an ability to grasp, the nuances of corruption, especially in fragile states, because civil society organizations from the grassroots level know it better. They know about the mechanisms of corruption. They know how and why it happens, who are the key players, and especially this information from grassroots players will give a voice to the victims of corruption as well, which is very important to bring a human face to the anti-corruption policies and actions, because beyond the figures, and statistics, there are human lives who are affected by the corruption, especially in those fragile countries. So having these voices translated into research and investigations, data and knowledge produced by civil society is really crucial. If I give you an example of such reference, we at Transparency International, as you know, produce a CPI annually, the Corruption Perceptions Index. So we are measuring the level of corruption in 180 countries over the world. This gives us a big picture and ranking of the level of perceived corruption. But the CPI, and we have to know that, is complemented by national research produced by our chapters and focusing on a wide range of areas, coming from natural resources governance, corruption in public procurement, illicit financial flows, of course, but also social sectors such as health and education. So all of this information compiled and combined with the information that we also get from our ALACs. ALACs stand for Advocacy and Legal Advice Centers, through which TI listens to the victims of corruption and really treat their cases for free. So all of this data is presented to international actors as a background information, helping them to shape their policies better, and also to inform them on the key areas to be discussed with the government. The second thing I would say, second contribution that civil society can make in informing international actors is more about awareness and also trust building. It is essential because most of the time civil society organizations are more trusted on the ground than international players or even the government. So civil society can act as an intermediary between internationally driven policies and also meeting the local needs. So this trust building part is really, really important. And of course, it is linked to the advocacy that those civil society are leading towards the government. They are highlighting, analyzing the public policies and informing all the players about the crucial reforms to be made, for instance, based on the population's need. But this is not an easy game, I would say, because civil society worldwide face lots of challenges. The first challenge is, of course, is the scarcity and the limitation of resources, because undertaking research and investigations need, funding and resources, and most of the time, especially for small CSOs, those resources are limited. So it also limits the scope of action of CSOs. Second obstacle is the polarization sometimes of civil society, because you have lots of small CSOs acting in their respective roles without getting united around the cause. So that may reduce the efficiency of civil society action. But the third main obstacle for me will be the threats against anti-corruption campaigners and organizations, because we have noticed in the 5 last years that the attacks, threats, judicial harassment, and everything against anti-corruption campaigners and organizations have increased dramatically. Our chapters in Georgia and in Brazil, for instance, are subject to these attacks. And there are lots of activists. You have Gubad, for instance, Dr. Gubad in Azerbaijan. He is an anti-corruption activist who have been detained and jailed and now placed under house arrest for reporting about corruption. So you have all of this, and sometimes there is a lack of legislation protecting whistleblowers and also anti-corruption activists. So all of this combines make it difficult for us to act. And the last obstacle is that even, let's say in a perfect world, we produce meaningful data, we have everything, and we lend this to international organizations. Now I'm speaking from the local perspective. It's like we are sometimes preaching in the desert, because we rarely receive some feedback from international institutions. For instance, in Madagascar, we are really meeting the IMF delegation 3-4 times a year, and they have each time a full report of the evidence we collect about corruption, all the embezzlement, everything, and we are warning them against, some tentatives from the government, to pay less attention to the shortages of good governance. But nonetheless, deals are contracted between the IMF and the government, not only the IMF, I mean the regular donors, international donors, without, in our sense, a real assessment of what we have been presenting. So we are wondering, did our voice matter? Does our analysis matter for anyone, or it's just about ticking a box somewhere like, okay, we met with civil society organizations, it's all good to go. So there's room for improvement on that.
Thanks so much, Kay. I think really given us some insights into how challenging it can be to operate in these kinds of environments with so many issues around trust and resources. I'm going to turn now to Victor. You're head of the anti-corruption agency in Ukraine, so no stranger to these challenges. It's, of course, a country in the midst of conflict. How does it feel from your perspective to have international organizations like the IMF engaging on anti-corruption and governance issues? And can I ask you, is it a help or a hindrance to your work?
Thank you so much for your question. First of all, I want to say thanks for being here. I am really proud to be here, and in this country, in Vilnius, where I walking through the street can see on every second street the flag of Ukraine. And it's great support for people of Ukraine who are suffering from full-scale military aggression of Russian Federation. And I want to say that yes, presence of international organizations like IMF is significant for Ukraine, and it's really helpful. First of all, I want to say that it's according to that we have war, we have limited domestic resources, and help of international organizations, not just financial help, but also expertise they gave us, and best practices is really useful for making changes in Ukraine. And presence of international organizations like IMF help Ukrainian state agencies to highlight the importance of anti-corruption measures that need to be done in Ukraine. And of course, the presence of IMF and other international organizations can place substantial pressure on domestic stakeholders to improve their work and making changes on anti-corruption and good governance reforms. And of course, I want to highlight that Ukraine, it's moving to European Union and other international organizations. And of course, presence and help of international agencies, international organizations help us to be in line with all European Union, OECD and NATO recommendations and requirements. And we need to change our laws according to the requirements. And it's great when we have good best practices, good practices, and help of IMF and international organizations to improve and to ensure our will for changes. For example, I want to highlight that in Ukraine, according to the surveys that NACP have made, 73% of people say that corruption is one of the main problems in the country after the war. 97%, of course, but the real number, it's not real number of showing level of corruption in Ukraine, because the real number of people who are facing corruption, it's in 4 times less than 73%. It's about 19%. But this number, 73%, shows a great will of people of Ukraine to make changes and to live in a corruption-free country. And of course, the significant help of international organizations give real support for people to achieve these results. And of course, one of main measures that can help Ukraine is also presence of international organizations in monitoring of those measures that we are doing and we are implementing. And it helps to maintain progress and ensure that anti-corruption initiatives, they are sufficient for long term. And of course, the all help of international organizations that can be provided for Ukraine is significant for for us now in this time.
That's very good to hear. So we've heard from all of these different perspectives on the panel. We've got, I think, some of the setting the scene in terms of what some of the issues and problems are. I want to get now into a little bit more the nitty-gritty of involvement of international financial institutions like the IMF in fragile and conflict-affected states. And this time I'm going to start with Emmanuel. Could you tell us a bit more about how the fund engages with states where power is so unstable and often fragmented? We've heard also from Kay about polarization. Authorities are sometimes seen as extractive, of course, in these situations, or kleptocratic. What does it mean to agree on meaningful conditionality in an IMF program in those kinds of circumstances?
No, thank you. And obviously, that's a big challenge. And to step back, when we talk about conditionality at the IMF, what does it mean? It's in the context when a member country comes to us to ask for financing in relation to an economic crisis and agrees on conditions with the IMF staff in order to get out of the crisis. So we go back to this concept of macroeconomically relevant conditions to get out of the crisis. And in many fragile and conflict states, the vast majority of them, corruption is pervasive. In a number of them, the state is captured. And in all of them, our counterparts are the authorities. So when we discuss an IMF-supported program, it is most often with the Minister of Finance, with the governor of the central bank, and in some instances with the president of the country. So you can imagine that in the context that Liz described, the discussions may be quite difficult in order to achieve meaningful reforms on governance and anti-corruption. So that's in part why 2 years ago, in 2022, the IMF adopted a new policy on fragile and conflict states. One of the important takeaway has been that we can do better in looking at the longer term of reforms. That's not easy for us because the programs we have, the fund-supported programs, are generally maximum 3 to 4 years. But I'm certain that all of you know in this room that corruption-related reforms, we cannot achieve them in 3 to 4 years. But that doesn't mean that we cannot do anything in 3 to 4 years. What it does mean is that we need to have a plan of a long term with milestones that cover these 3 to 4 years and that are meaningful in order to achieve a better equilibrium. Because in some of these countries, there is unfortunately a bad equilibrium where corruption actually is a source of maintaining peace between different constituents in a country. And in this type of environment, it's quite challenging to find reforms that would bring from that bad equilibrium to a better one. That's where in our policy on fragile and conflict states, in our policy on governance, we have been increasingly working on two things: political economy analysis, as said earlier, understanding the context, understanding who owns what in the country, who owns the land, and also a longer-term approach in order to assist our member countries. And I would like to here mention a few important considerations. The first one is that the IMF doesn't lead reforms in a country. What we can only do is to facilitate reforms. That's why talking to civil society, talking to all stakeholders is very important. That's why doing it in the context of the governance diagnostics we mentioned earlier is also critical, because if it's only one-off, like Kay mentioned earlier, that may not bring much progress. Actually, we will be engaging in a governance diagnostic with Madagascar very soon, and hopefully that will help address the structural issues. Second is that we are trying to implement what we call corruption filter to all of our economic policies, which means you may look at one economic policy advice that doesn't seem related to corruption, but in an environment where corruption is so severe, it always goes back to corruption. It always goes back to the greed, the rent, and how some in the country may capture the rent to their profit. And so we are trying to look at the general political economic advice we are offering through this lens. The third one is that in difficult environment like this one, direct anti-corruption measure may not be the short-term priority. Direct anti-corruption measure may be setting up an anti-corruption agency. If corruption is so pervasive, it may not go very far. However, some other measures that take into account the significance of corruption may make a big difference, like, for example, in foreign exchange related, like, for example, in the way the revenue administration, the tax administration is structured. But obviously, certainly not an easy situation. I just want to end with one example of our work. A fragile country in sub-Saharan Africa, the Republic of Congo, certainly fits a number of the elements that Liz mentioned earlier. We had a governance diagnostic in 2018 in that country. We have an ongoing IMF-supported program. As a result of the recommendations from this diagnostic, which have been owned by the authorities, a number of mostly legal regulatory reforms have been implemented. And we have been moving now from the legal and regulatory to the implementation. And earlier this year, the authorities agreed to require high-level officials to submit asset declarations and to publish them on a website that anybody can access. The website is on. The compliance is not where we would like to see it yet, but it's just an example of how we can help progress, including in difficult environment, because to us, having the civil society, having the public, having the banks abroad, able to see the asset declaration of top officials in this type of jurisdiction may really help keep down the most outrageous cases of corruption. Thank you.
Thanks, Emmanuel. I think that gives us some insights into some of the trade-offs that you're facing and some of the pragmatic decisions that need to be made there. I'd like to turn to Kay and then Victor. So from your perspective, do you have any suggestions on how best international financial institutions should build relationships with the local stakeholders? Particularly, what strikes me is that with the international financial institutions, you've got these loan agreements, you've got points of review, there are conditions that are supposed to be met. But in the meantime, it's often up to the local stakeholders to keep up the pressure and to make sure that those things are really implemented. So I'll go to Kay first. If you could just give us your insights on how best to manage that.
Yeah, so first I would like to get back to what Emmanuel said. I totally agree with the fact that corruption is at the root cause of all phases of fragility that we are facing, may it be political, economical, or social. So that's why it is crucial for us to build this collaboration and partnership, because you're right, Liz, the pressure has to be maintained and has to come from local stakeholders. But most of the time it's very difficult when the government doesn't listen to those local stakeholders. We need to rely on international institutions as allies in helping us put in that pressure and maintaining it. And first, doing so, I think that the first main solution to implement is really to bring in civil society on board so that they can monitor what are the engagements of the government in the agreements made between the government and institutional, international institutions. Because if we are not aware of what is at stake, then we cannot monitor them. Of course, you tell me that all the briefs of the IMF and all organizations are available online, but we have to go in more deeper maybe and engage in a constructive dialogue. You have to explain us what is at stake once again and what is the core heart of those agreements, because they are very technical. You will agree with me that it's not everybody who can understand, for instance, the conditionalities or the financial aspects of such agreements. You have also to build civil society's capacity to understand this and bring them on board all along the process, not just for some periodic consultations in the beginning or afterwards for assessing what have been achieved or not, but through all the process. So this constant engagement will also value, the contributions of civil society and make them feel meaningful. This is something really crucial. And also, there is a need to not only listen, as I said, to civil society, but sometimes, most of the time, try to implement what they are saying, because all of the recommendations, all of the solutions, suggestions proposed to do not only governments, but all of the international actors are meant, to help in finding solutions and overcoming this fragility which occurs in so many countries. So they are based on thorough research and they are significant. So try to give more consideration to those findings and also recommendations. And thirdly, I would say, getting back to the experience of Transparency International, we have developed a tool named Integrity Pact. And we are advocating for it to be used, especially in public procurement, especially in difficult environment. So the Integrity Pact is both a signed document and approach to public contracting, which commits a contracting authority and bidens to comply with the best practice and maximum transparency. It gets civil society organization as a third party which is going to monitor the compliance from the governmental side, and ensure that everything in terms of transparency, accountability, and integrity are respected. In Madagascar, for instance, we have proposed a few times to meet with the representative of the IMF to present the integrity pacts. Not a single answer to the email. I'm sorry to take in this stage to emphasize that, but this is an example of the frustration which local civil society organizations, not only in my country, but in several countries, especially in Africa, feel when engaging with international institutions. Like, we have some tools in hand, we would like to help, but if all doors are closed, how can we make a difference? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kay. And a warning to us all to answer our emails, because you might get called out on the stage. So turning to Victor, same question. What's your advice on how international financial institutions can best build the relationships with local stakeholders?
Thanks. I want to say that many issues have already been told by previous speakers, but I'll try to describe it in my own perspective from Ukrainian side. First of all, I want to propose some three main strategies. First of all, it's transparency. One word. Transparency is the best strategy because it builds trust among all stakeholders who are involved in this process. International agencies, state agencies, local governments, and civil society. Second, it's developing monitoring and evaluation mechanism that help us control work of state agencies and cooperation and coordination. For example, in Ukraine, we have such maybe two main monitoring and evaluation mechanisms. It's matrix of reforms that has information implemented by government and has information about all reforms we need to do according to the requirements of European Union, OECD, NATO, and other international partners. And also one of such mechanisms is implemented by NACP, National Agency Corruption Prevention. It's information system of monitoring state anti-corruption program. State anti-corruption program is a complicated document that consists of 1,187 measures to be done by 109 state agencies who are involved in implementation of state anti-corruption program. And this monitoring system help all these state agencies to control what measures they need to do, the result of implementation, the process of implementation, and also this information, this system consists of two parts. One is hidden for state agencies where they can put information, and another with visual effect, with results for civil society, for international partners, where everybody from this room can see on Ukrainian and English the result of implementation of state anti-corruption program and measures that already have been done and need to be done till the end of 2025. And the last but not least, I want to say that it was already told, collaboration and coordination between all stakeholders. We need to establish regular channels of communication with all stakeholders. We can create platforms where stakeholders can voice their concerns and provide feedback and suggest improvements. It's also in some ways implemented, for example, in this mentioned monitoring system I told previously, because every person from civil society can complain that some measures, for example, they mentioned that they are done, but they are not done correct. And the information of, for example, state agency is incorrect. And we can use this information. That's why I think this main three strategies is a great example how we can enhance and improve our work and our collaboration and communication with all stakeholders.
Great, yes. That old chestnut around coordination and communication, so important, but generally difficult to do as well. So I'm going to turn in a moment to Diane, but after we hear from Diane, I'm going to open up to the floor. So again, do think about what questions you might want to ask our great panelists. So Diane, you've got a lot of experience of doing political economy analysis in many parts of the world, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East. Thinking about the learnings from your experience, but also from what we've heard from the other panelists, how best should we use political economy analysis, particularly to do that kind of sustainable and meaningful reform in contexts that are, as we've heard, inevitably unstable, polarized, low in resources? What are your sort of chief takeaways on how to do this well?
Thank you. Listen, I think we've heard really interesting things, and there are many threads that we can pull out of this conversation. Maybe I'll focus on 3 of them, and we can explore others later. I think to me one of the first lessons learned, both from my own work with the IMF, the World Bank, and from what I've heard today, is that one of the best way to use political economy analysis is to address the difficult questions, right? And you've put your finger on, one of the central conundrums in your question, which is, and I think Emmanuel, you also raised it, which is that trade-off between stability and corruption fights, right? In fragile states, that's really like one of the main trade-offs, one of the main conundrums we have to struggle with. And we've been really sort of trying to think that through. Recently in sub-Saharan Africa, we know there's been a stream of coups, right? Those coups have in large part emerged because of corruption. Yet addressing corruption in the post-coup era does mean sort of cutting rents among elites that, are in a very fragile equilibrium. So we know that sort of going full on in the corruption fight increases a risk that you sort of feed elite infighting and therefore sort of nurture instability. So that's definitely not a call not to do anything, but it's, a good reason to sort of use political economy analysis as a space to think through this trade-off and think through how we can mitigate risks, because not sort of, we cannot just stay there and think, okay, can't do anything, it's too fragile, we have to do something. We've seen that in countries where we haven't thought through that trade-off, things have gone wrong. And Lebanon, you were mentioning before, Lebanon is a good example of that. During many years, we assumed that corruption was a second-order problem because somehow sort of elites sharing the rents allowed some form of stability. It turns out that it was poisonous, right? Because we all know what the situation is today. So it's a difficult question in fragile states, but I think political economy analysis and our collective thinking can help think about those trade-offs and how to sort of push a corruption fight in an environment that's sort of moving and unstable, and where we both want to fight corruption and also ensure some level of avoid conflict, essentially. So that to me is the first sort of use that we can make of it. And the second lesson learned, and I think we've also heard this in different interventions, is that we sort of need to work towards good enough governance. Second best, but workable solutions in those difficult environments. And this is both about sort of addressing the macroeconomically critical, sort of going for those real binding constraints, but also about sort of making sure that we work around not best practices, but sort of question our assumptions. So take transparency. I think we all agree around in this panel that transparency is critical. We also know that in many places in fragile states where we've pushed transparency, many of our assumptions have not worked out. Transparency has not led to accountability, and it has not reduced corruption. And that's at least in the short term. And so we do need to think a bit more strategically in those places about what can be done in sort of priority. Do we need to use, more targeted approaches to transparency, say in procurement? Instead of having full-fledged procurement contract, do we go for high-value contracts in their review? Or, those sorts of things. What are real game-changing measures that are politically implementable? Transparency without sort of strengthening accountability, whether in the public sector or supporting demand from CSOs and supporting their role in pushing forward the use of that data and information, is also not very likely to work. So it's really a call sort of to think about possibly second best, more targeted, but also sort of more impactful measures. And maybe the last point, if I have one more minute, is about the process. And I think that's, to me, one of the main threads coming out of that conversation, right? It's the how, right? How do we sort of ensure reform success? And, the best way you can use political economy analysis is actually as a process. As a process not only, as Kay was mentioning, to sort of gather information, data, local knowledge about corruption and what can be done, but also as a process to sort of figure out how we can collectively push, leverage different voices, influence, whether conditionality or pressure and demand from civil society, and sort of bring together different resources and entry points, because there's something that IFIs can do, a type of pressure they can create, and some things that civil society can do on their own. So it's really about, I think, trying to forge an agreement, and it's not an easy one, and we've seen it today, right? Forging an agreement on first-order things, and rather than among different actors, and in such a way that the reform list is not too long and can actually be managed and pushed for.
Thanks so much. I think these are really great insights. I'm learning a lot from listening to you all. Time to hear from the audience. So can I ask, if you have a question, could you please raise your hand? I'm not sure if we have a roving mic. We do? Yeah, okay. So sorry, could you put your hands up again? Okay, so we'll hear from this gentleman here, and then lady at the back, and then we've got two at the front. So if you could please briefly state where you're from, and then briefly state your question.
My name is Peter Kronze. I'm from Transparency International. I've been working in the German Development Corporation for a long time. My question is one comment. I think the question whether it's ticking a box or whether you take it seriously what the civil society says. It's also a question of cooperation between the international civil society. In Germany, at least that's my background, if a politician, a minister, is traveling to one of these countries we're talking about, the civil society looks very, very carefully whether this politician is going to see and talk to the civil society in these countries. One question which has to do with priorities, long-term, short-term. In Afghanistan, about 70–80% of the money coming from outside went to the military in one way or the other. If you have a look at the Ukraine, that's more or less the same. What does that mean? What do you look, the international organizations, do you also look at the money going to the military sector, or is that not an island of integrity, but an island which is not looked at? Where are the possibilities to do something in a country like Ukraine about corruption in defense, or is that something where we close the eyes?
Great, thank you very much. So now, lady at the back there.
Thank you so much. Good morning. My name is Maartje Hofs. I have another type of difficult question that I don't feel we've asked here, and I would like your advice on. Many international organizations working in certain countries, they don't necessarily dare to ask some of the difficult questions, especially now we see this as well in West Africa, because they're mainly as well always working on building and maintaining their relationship with the host country that is there. And therefore, I think sometimes having been on both sides from civil society, but as well from international organizations, I see we're struggling with that. We're struggling between how do we prioritize our own relationship and building that relationship, so maybe one day we can have that reform, we can have that discussion over what is necessary and how can we push further. So I'd really like your advice as well on how sometimes we could have a bit more courage in pushing for these conversations, and not everything is about that building relationship, and sometimes anti-corruption or building integrity measures also need a priority. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Great question. Then in the front here, first the lady and then the gentleman in the front row.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Svetlana. I'm coming from Ukraine. I want to make a short comment and pose a question. My comment will be that actually I'm very happy to see at this scene the representative of IMF, Transparency International, and an ACP, because these three persons together constitute what I would call a success story in Ukraine. Back then in 2015, IMF had one of its conditions for Ukraine establishment of an ACP, National Corruption Prevention Agency. The agency has been established. It was not that successful from the very first moment, but later on, after several amendments and reforms, it became a state-of-the-art institution, I would say, today. And Transparency International played a very important and crucial role in the latest selection of the head of an ACP that is present on the scene. So I believe I would like to praise the success also, not only criticize, so to say, and I would like to say that these people here represent a very good example of what Victor said collaboration is. So thanks to all of the participants of this process, so to say. And my question will be more to Emmanuel and Diane, I guess, because where I do see the risk is in creating islands of integrity. Because, you know, in Ukraine, for example, we have this NACP state of the art. We have NABU, we have representative of National Anti-Corruption Bureau here in the audience, the detective. These institutions were created with the support of international partners and present a very good example of integrity in its operations. At the same time, my next question, and I would like to bring this discussion forward, would be how do we move from islands of integrity to the land of integrity, right? How do we make sure that we not only create the small pieces of integrity that do not play together, but we move towards greater integrity, which will be built on a whole society approach. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Gentleman next to you.
Hi, my name is Tim Hanstead. I'm with the Chandler Foundation. Thank you, first of all, to the panel and to the IMF, who I understand coordinated this. My question is mostly directed to Emmanuel, but maybe part of it for others as well. You mentioned the three tools, and I'm just wondering what, on the third one, the governance and corruption risk diagnostic, what triggers those diagnostics, and to what extent does that tool relate to the second one in terms of integrating conditions of corruption into the lending? I think you said that happens in situations where corruption is macroeconomically relevant. And I'm just wondering how you're defining, because I imagine people in this room would have very different answers to the question of when is it relevant. And then third, and I think related to this, it goes to the question of civil society connecting with IMF, which I imagine from the IMF side might be a little bit challenging because who's representing civil society and all of that. But to what extent, and is the open government partnership framework used or by the IMF or seen as a way in which the IMF can interact with civil society? Because there you have a mechanism for civil society to talk. And to what extent the recommendations within your diagnostics could be integrated into OGP national action plans?
Thanks very much. Some excellent questions. So we're going to go to each of the panel members in turn, starting with Victor. And then if you could please choose which questions you'd like to respond to. You don't necessarily have to respond to them all, please.
I think I'll try to answer the question about defense sector. As already told, it's a great problem for Ukraine that we have lack of domestic resources, and of course financial help from abroad, it's vital for Ukraine, and part of them it's social issues, part of them it's also defense and our resilience, and nowadays it's also important recovery and reconstruction, because we need to live in our country, we need to have business, we need to have investments, we need to help our guys who are on the battlefield and front line. Talking about safeguards in against corruption in the defense sphere, I want to say that, for example, as Svetlana told, we have our on islands of integrity. It's anti-corruption state agencies. It's NABU, SAPO, State Anti-Corruption Prosecutor Office, High Anti-Corruption Court, and NACP. The NACP is agency that forming shaping policy, anti-corruption policy in country. And for example, in defense sphere, we have separate department which copes with questions of mitigating and eliminating corruption risks. And for example, we make special researches on state agencies, state properties, and different spheres of life. For example, procurement of non-lethal non-lethal procurements under martial law, for example, we are making. And we propose state agencies, government, parliament to make amendments to improve their work to reduce the corruption risk. And I think it's main our work to form ability not to have at all corruption risk in different spheres. And for example, talking not about defense, but about recovery and reconstruction, we already have implemented a DREAM system. It's a system that has information about all projects on reconstruction and recovery, and they are published there. They are wholly transparent, and every person in our country can see all the projects and all the money spent for recovery and reconstruction. I think it's maybe main issues can be implemented in Ukraine for defense and recovery sphere. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Victor. Kay.
I wanted to speak a little bit about the courage of, asking difficult questions from the part I won't answer for IFIs, obviously, but I think this courage has to be developed, and it's about audacity. And if you have the right information in hand, provided by local organizations, trusted ones, and produced in a very, thorough process in terms of scientificity and also integrity, then you can have the luxury to have this courage of saying things despite the consequences. And we have seen for some organizations more and more of this courage in some countries in the latest years. And we just have to salute that. But sometimes, in Madagascar for this year, the ambassador of the European Union dared to speak out against, embezzlement of international aid and misappropriation of some funds and lack of efficiency from the government. She has just been expelled out of the country. That's sometimes a price to pay. But nonetheless, if the bigger international organization or institution endorse what its representative is doing, then I think that this kind of courage and action is meaningful and can make a difference within the country, because it gives a positive signal of the readiness of IFIs to tackle the root cause of the problems. So I would encourage really international institutions to show up a little more on that side, to be more courageous, because, once again, the lives of millions of people are at stake. So, of course, it's very good to have policies in place and to have, all the filters that we want. But if you don't dare to kick the elephant out of the room, then maybe things won't change. So, go for it. That would be my speech. And also in terms of the corruption and in the defense sector, just to remind the audience that our defense and security GTNI is working also on Transparency International, then has a GTNI on defense and security. And we are producing the government Defense and Integrity Index, which can be a good reference for those who are interested on that topic. And this can be of useful use for international organizations and institutions interested in the topic. We have a representative in the room, so if you're interested, just ping us. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Emmanuel?
Yeah, thank you. Maybe going back to your question on governance and corruption diagnostics. Who demands it? The countries. It's technical assistance, so it's at their request. However, we already published or finalized 20 of them. All of these came into the context of an IMF-supported program. So in that context, the IMF staff discusses with country authorities, and we agree with them that requesting this type of diagnostic is helpful to build long-term reforms. Actually, the first one of these diagnostics we did was with Ukraine back in 2014. And that was quite helpful at having a roadmap of reforms. All what has been the law enforcement structure in Ukraine was discussed with stakeholders and authorities at the time. Obviously, context differs. In some countries, civil society is more organized, is more technical. Certainly, Ukraine is a case in point. Many of you know how civil society organizations in Ukraine are very specific and know very well the topics, acts as safeguards when new actions come in parliament, and are very active in holding accountable everybody, from the authorities to organizations like ours, asking the difficult question, helping us to advance. So that's really also an important part. To go back to the governance diagnostic and the interaction with the lending programs, it depends on the countries. In some countries, I mentioned Ukraine, really very strong integration. More recently, we have had the governance diagnostic in Zambia and in Sri Lanka, a very strong integration with IMF-supported programs. Other countries, much less. But and that's where I'll come to the other question related to the trade-off between maintaining, building relationships, and to the importance of policies. And when we say, oh, we have a new policies on governance in 2018 or a new policy on fragile and conflict states in 2022, that may appear just like, okay, another policy. For the IMF, it's really systemic, because it allows us to discuss this issue with our 190 member countries the same way. And when we go to a country in the context of the annual health check, some member authorities, as we discussed, don't have any interest in discussing corruption. And actually they will tell us, no, we don't want to discuss corruption. Then we come with, oh, but we have this policy, you are bound with this policy, we discuss that with your neighbor, we have to discuss that with you, look what we wrote on your neighbor country. And so that really helps us, not only, so it does not only require courage, it also requires the ability to implement this. And so having this policy is very helpful. Having the governance diagnostic as a tool is very helpful. The political economy that is underlying the analysis is very helpful, including for the countries where at this stage, maybe not much progress will be possible. But having in the public domain an analysis that is well substantiated on what are steps that a number of stakeholders think are critical for a country is very important to have published, so that the day window opens, there is the possibility to push for some of these reforms, and to push for reforms that are well thought for. The worst we have been doing as international financial institution is when the window opens, we are not ready, and we push for reforms that are helpless, that are not known, that are not owned by the civil society, that are not owned by the new authorities, that ultimately appear like a check the box. It's not misguided, but it's misinformed, and what we are trying to do is to be better informed and better able to act whenever we can. Thank you.
Thanks, that's very good to hear. Diane.
Thanks. I think there's been already a lot of interesting responses. Maybe I'll take on the continue a bit building on what Emmanuel was saying. on sort of how much can you sort of talk about these things with client countries, how much do IFIs push for it. And I think we need to pause just a second and have a bit of a historical perspective. I think, you know, it's not perfect, but we're better today than we were 10 or 15 years ago. There has been, I think, a change, both in terms of, you know, the policy, if you look at the IMF, those policies that create space, at least to talk about difficult issues, or if you look at the, you know, UN agencies, the World Bank, IMF, the sort of increasing use of those political economy analysis that sort of allow at least, you know, that conversation to happen. And I think we need to remember that that conversation was not actually happening 10 or 15 years ago. So it's imperfect, but I think in historical perspective, we're in a different space today than we were 10 or 15 years ago. Now, the way to, you know, it's a difficult question that's been asked, and I think the way IFIs try to do it is sort of, you know, try to figure out who to talk to in government. Governments are not homogeneous, even in captured states, even in fragile states, governments are not homogeneous places, right? You do have different peoples, you have reform champions embedded here and there, and so the question is also, you know, figuring out who to talk to and who might be responsive. So it's the question of sort of who you talk to, it's also a question of timing, right? Being prepared. Sometimes you can push, but it's, you know, you get kicked out of the country. What we can do is be better prepared to sort of get into those windows of opportunities that Emmanuel was talking about. So, you know, sometimes it's also a question of timing. The other thing also is, I think, and it goes back a bit to the courage that you were mentioning, Kay, I think sometimes we sort of shy off from having difficult conversations that governments actually want to have. So, you know, conversation around clientelism in the public administration. You know, a first tendency would be to say, oh, no, let's not talk about this because they're putting all their party people in key positions. Actually, when you start talking to people in government about it, they're relieved that you're having this conversation with them because that's an actual real political question they have. They still, you know, they have their clientele, but they also want to reform their public administration and make it more efficient and performant. So, you know, sometimes I think there's a lot of gray areas and we have to sort of go into those gray areas, and they're often better received than what we expect them to, not on all topics, but on some corruption-related topics.
Great, thanks so much. We've got time, I think, for a couple more questions. Okay, so I've got one here and then one over there. Again, if you could just briefly state who you are and then your question fairly quickly.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Sarah Bendali, and Kay mentioned I'm the representative. I oversee our defense and security program at Transparency International. Thank you for the panel. One of the things that has come across as a thread is that corruption certainly is a national security threat. It compromises peace and stability, but it also exacerbates conflict, as I think everyone in the panel noted. So I do like the interventions around prioritizing corruption and it not being an afterthought. But I want to push the panel further, beyond just the tools and the partnerships. What other preemptive measures can be undertaken at the outset before we even reach the stage of conflict and instability even occurring? Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. There's one over here. Yeah.
Thank you. Peter Jonoth, German Development Corporation, Iraq. Thank you. Very interesting panel, very interesting discussion. I'll keep it very simple. Emmanuel, you hit on a topic, and I think it's a topic that if you're in international development, it is something at the forefront. The structure of development and interventions and programs is usually 3 years. You mentioned that's a short term. How do you see international development agencies such as yourself, my organization and others, addressing the short-term nature of a lot of the interventions? How do you anchor the programs that you speak about, the interventions, the reforms, in a way that they're sustainable past the 3 years? Because we always look at the 3-year, and it's a cycle that is part of the framework that we work in. So my question is, what do you see as some of the answers that we can do in having that 10-year, because you really, for governance, you need 10 years. You really need a longer-term framework. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And we've just got one final question in the front row here, please.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Evgen Tokar. I am representative of Ukraine National Anti-Corruption Bureau. My question is, what do you think about the idea of direct involving the representatives of civil society and international partners in providing some crucial reforms, especially in anti-corruption sphere? For example, in Ukraine, we have great examples when the representatives of civil society and international partners become the members of commissions, for example, for electing judges, for creating new state agencies, for selecting their heads. So it shows that our story shows that this experience is quite successful. What do you think about it?
Thanks very much. Also going to abuse my position as chair and ask you a couple more questions. One of the themes that kept coming up was around research and evidence and transparency. That's a big problem also in these kinds of states because we can't always trust the data that we're getting. So I wonder, is this something that the IMF engages on? How do you deal with this as practitioners who need that evidence? And related to that, the political economy analysis that's done, it's often kept private. Should that be something that is published and that is out there for all of us to see? This is something that Peter Evans and Stefan Durkon have been promoting with their practical politics platform. What do you think about that idea? Second question, you've talked about the difficulty of having interlocutors in government who might actually be involved in state capture. But an equally difficult problem is around building back after state capture. Maybe you've got a new government that you trust, but actually how do you then start to change the institutions that have perhaps been extremely politicized without it looking like you're doing the same thing and you're undermining the rule of law? So how do you get a law enforcement institution that you can trust and that you can deal with, that needs independence and autonomy, but at the same time needs to work with all of those other institutions in the state? And I think we'll go in the usual order, if that's okay. So first of all, to Victor, then Kay, Emmanuel, and Diane. And I'm sorry, you've got about 2 minutes each.
Thanks. I'll try to be short. First of all, I'll have some little conflict of interest answering the question of my colleague previously. But answering these two topics, one question about forming trust to law enforcement agencies. Ukraine, I think, is a great example where it was possible to establish new anti-corruption agencies. And now BUSAPO, High Corruption Court, I've already told, it's a great example of involvement of civil society in this process. And when I talk to other people on international panels, I say always that in Ukraine, we had no ability to modernize law enforcement agencies that are existing. And establishing new ones was a great example. Civil society in Ukraine helped state with the political will to form people who are willing to have changes, to make changes in our life and changing the life of all people in Ukraine. And I already told it's conflicts, but I believe in our country. And for last 10 years, as it was a question about short term or long term, I believe that 10 years is also not a long term period. And for example, in Singapore, they are planning their measures for 50 years. And it's a great example where we need to go. I think we need to plan for such a long period.
Thanks so much, Victor. Great. Kay.
Yeah, I will speak first to Sarah's questions, like how to prevent, even conflicts and which kind of approach we have to make. I think we at Transparency International have been built, around the idea of multi-stakeholder engagement. This is a concept that Peter Eigen and the co-founders have promoted for a long time, and I think that this approach is still relevant today. And among this multi-stakeholder engagement, you have at the same time the government, civil society, the IFAs, and people from academia, which joins your question, Liz, on the reliability of data and research. I think that if all of these components work together, but keeping at the same time reservation for expressing criticism when it's needed, I mean constructive criticism, then things may evolve in a positive direction, and this can help preventing conflict. But not only this, keeping alive a culture of dialogue and partnership is crucial. Once again, if all doors are open, it's easier, you know, to work and collaborate together. And on the OGP, I wanted to say a word on that. That's an excellent framework which can really be a reference to IFIs, but the limitations from a country perspective is that some fragile countries are not even members of the OGP, and Madagascar is part of it, because we are lacking one first pillar, the law accessing information, the law to access to information. This is the first pillar of transparency, and we don't have it. So that should be, in our sense already, a point where the IMF can put pressure on the government. I know you did, but maybe increasing it a little bit, because otherwise we won't cross the extra mile, and you know we'll miss the opportunities given by such structures. So accountability, the culture of transparency and accountability have to be built at all levels, and if we sometimes escape this culture of state capture, then we will have to rebuild everything, including the judiciary and all the institutions. And there, once again, the contribution of civil society is meaningful in selecting, for instance, spotting people with integrity, judges, magistrates, you know, key people within the administration. Civil society can help doing that. So we're here to help, once again.
Thank you very much. You're all doing very well at sticking to time. Emmanuel?
Yeah, thanks, and lots of very interesting questions. I'll try to focus on the one on short-term, long-term, because this is really critical. It's and not only for my organization, but more generally. And the 3 years, yes, in funding programs, in programs of international organization, but there is also often the 3 years in human capital. So mission chiefs, project managers, often in organization like ours, 3 years is also the term. And there is a loss of memory after that. So how have we at the IMF been trying to resolve this? So in the context of our policy on fragile and conflict states, we introduced the concept of a country engagement strategy. So that's a document that is within the IMF that serves as a memory, institutional memory on a country. It's a document that analyzes the political economy, the drivers of fragility, what are the key structural reforms that are needed, how do we go from the bad equilibrium of fragile state is to exiting the fragility trap, what are the different milestones, so that we have this with us related to what Liz said. Part of it is published, part of it is confidential, and you may understand why some of the elements are better kept confidential, but you may also understand why some of the elements needs to be published in order to have markers and to express what is the view of our institution in order to help going out of the trap. Our governance and corruption diagnostics also help in this regard. As mentioned earlier, some are acted on quite quickly, on some key reforms, quickly meaning 3-4 years. Others, it's good to have them here in case something happens. And so that these are tools that we are trying to implement to address this issue, but it's certainly one of the most critical issues we face, and I'm sure others face. Thank you.
Thanks, Emmanuel. Diane?
Thank you. Well, maybe I'll sort of wrap up on your question on research and transparency. You know, you're right that that's a big question, right? We're working on issues that are, by essence, very difficult to capture, analyze, especially in fragile states where we have very little data on very simple things like budgets, right? So one of the ways of working around this is, or working with this constraint, is also to sort of really invest in qualitative research, right? This is what allows us to triangulate, and this is also where sort of consulting widely with NGOs, but also with journalists, with academics, and sort of trying to piece together a story. And sometimes we don't need the numbers. What we need is the story and the structural elements, right? So that's how we sort of get around a little bit that data constraint. Now, on whether it should be kept private or made public, that's really, I think, a question that comes, that comes up all the time, and it's a really difficult one because the question is, public for what, private for what, And so what's the objective of that political economy analysis or of those sort of sensitive analysis? In some cases, it's sort of helping internal thinking and strategizing, and you need to be able to say things in the raw way. It's also places, and it goes back to the data availability, where you're not always 100% sure of your data, right? And so you don't want to put data out there that's not fully triangulated. And so sometimes, there is a reason to think, okay, this is sort of for internal mulling, but there's also, I think, an increasing perception that, research and data are public goods, and that deliberations within international organizations should be at least partly public. And so there is, I think, also a push, and you were mentioning Peter Evans, but, at the World Bank and others in other places, where at least to put out part of that, maybe sometimes in a sanitized version without putting names and all, part of those results out there, because it goes back to a point that Kay was making, which is crucial, which is, we consult widely. And there is a question of accountability also to the people who have been consulted, and this notion that you sort of need to close the loop on that.
Excellent, thanks so much. I think this has been a really fascinating discussion. For me, it also sort of, I can't help reflecting on the maturity of this corruption debate now, that we're no longer seeing corruption as a purely technical problem. We recognize that it's intrinsically political. We recognize that it is a matter of national security. We recognize that it is macro-critical and absolutely essential to economic stability as well. So really delighted to see all of these strands coming together, and that this is something that is really being incorporated into the work of international financial institutions, who of course are often the ones who have quite a lot of clout and authority in the field and in practice. So all that remains is for me to say a big thank you to the panelists, and please join me in doing so.